Okay, so this video is basically just going to give you an idea of kind of how the inner workings of the locking mechanism work so that you can see how it functions, why it functions so well, why it's so effective. Okay, so you can see this is the Lockrite locking mechanism. It is our patented design. And you can see here, you see a hole here, you can see a hole here, and you can see this groove that runs the length. And if I turn it over, you'll see there's another groove on the other side, exactly the same. Okay? There are pins that basically insert into these holes, and when those pins are inserted, then of course the pole can't shift or move, can't be compressed or extended. So you'll see if I push on the end of the pole here, you see that hole is moving into the locking mechanism. I'm not pushing the buttons right now. So what that means is that the pins inside are waiting, basically spring-loaded, and they're going to pop into the holes on either side of this inner pole. Once they click in, then there's no way that I'm going to be able to separate this. Okay, so I can't extend it, I can't retract it, it won't compress. So you can put a lot of pressure on that, and it's not going to release as a cam locking mechanism design would. And then of course if I depress the buttons, then it extends very easily. If I release them, then it will click into place as soon as it meets a new set of holes. Okay, so that's basically kind of how it works in a nutshell, and then we'll show you the internal workings so you understand why and how it works. So you can see here, first of all, this is the locking mechanism collar, which holds it to the outer pole. This housing here comes in two halves, and then you of course got the two buttons on either side, and there are 4 screws that hold this together. You can see there's 2 screw holes here, and then on the flip side there are 2 more screw holes there. Those are what hold the 2 pieces, the 2 halves of the housing together. So the first step, if you were going to remove the locking mechanism from the pole, and the only time you would really need to do this, of course, is if you're having troubles with the locking mechanism and you have requested a replacement. And of course with a lifetime guarantee, then you receive as many replacements as you need. So if you ran into issues multiple times, you would receive multiple replacements. But trust me, this is a very solid design. It's very heavy duty. Chances of you needing very many replacements of this are pretty slim. But if you did, then the first thing that you would do to remove this from the pole so that you can replace it, and also recognize that the lifetime guarantee doesn't just cover the locking mechanism, it covers the entire pole. So if the outer pole got dented or damaged or bent, or the inner pole was dented or damaged or bent, or the handle was damaged in some way, it doesn't matter what component is the problem. It is lifetime guaranteed. So we would either send you that new component or we would send you the entire pole. Okay, so but if the locking mechanism needed to be removed, then you would simply remove these 2 screws that then allow the collar to be separated from the outer pole. Okay, so there's 1 screw, and there's the other screw. Once those are removed, then you can pull. I'm going to pull the pole out this way, and I'm going to pull the housing this direction and separate them. And if you do a little bit of twisting in the process, it makes it a little bit easier to separate them. Okay, but you can see that wasn't very difficult. You can see the holes where those screws hold the locking mechanism collar to the outer pole. Okay, once those are removed, then we're free here. So at this point, then we can separate the inner pole from the outer pole, and then we're going to remove the collar from the inner pole, or the whole housing. Okay, so now recognize that this inner pole can never be drawn all the way through the locking mechanism housing. There's a screw at the end of this, 2 screws, that basically prevent it from passing through the locking mechanism. So as long as the locking mechanism is attached to the outer pole, there is no way to separate the inner and the outer poles, which means it's never possible for you to lose half of your pole into the swimming pool. Okay, these will never come apart regardless of what happens with the handle or anything of that nature. That's not going to happen. Okay, so just understand that. That's an important note because there are some poles where people have that trouble. You'll never have that problem with the ProTuff pole. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is separate the two poles. And I'm going to continue moving this locking mechanism down the length of the pole so that it, and obviously in actual use, this would be much cleaner and much faster than this. I'm trying to keep it within the video, so it's a rather slow process, but the reality is this would go very quickly if you were doing it yourself, because you could basically do it all in one fluid motion. We're getting close to the end of the pole now. Okay, so you can see this screw here. Okay, that's the screw that would prevent the pole from ever passing through the housing. Okay, but since the housing has been removed, the collar has been separated from the outer pole, this now, of course, allows the two poles to be separated. Okay, so I'm going to separate this. I'm trying not to lose either pole here. Okay, so you can see they're not come apart. All right, so I'm going to bring this back into view here, and I'm going to move this back to the center of the pole just so that I can actually have the pole set on the table and not fall off. Okay, so here we are there, and I'm going to set the outer pole aside for a moment. Okay, so with the outer pole set aside, so again, that process would have been very quick because all it is you remove those two screws, you separate the housing from the outer pole, and then you just simply slide the inner pole out of the outer pole. So a very quick process, probably 30 seconds, honestly. So then is the process of separating the collar, the locking mechanism and collar from the inner pole. Okay, so in order to do that, then of course, I'm going to slide back now that I've got two hands available. And you can see here that screw is there, so what happens is it can't pass by that screw. Okay, it basically will get stuck there. Okay, so we have to remove those screws in order to separate the locking mechanism from the pole. Okay. Again, this is a little bit difficult to do here because I've got to try and hold up the other end of the pole while I'm doing this and keep it in view of the camera. But for you, it would be much easier. You'd probably have this setting on the ground so that the pole really couldn't go anywhere, and you wouldn't have to worry about that. Oops. Again, just simply remove the two screws, and once they're removed, then the locking mechanism will pass off, and now they're separate. So I'm just going to set this pole aside for a second. And so now you can see we just had the locking mechanism, and what we're going to do is we're now going to separate the two halves of the locking mechanism so you can see the internals. Oh. Yeah, forgot. This screwdriver is just a little bit large. I'm going to pause the video for a second and I'll be right back. Okay, so I'm back. Smaller screws in here, so a smaller screwdriver is necessary. They're all Phillips heads. They're not standard or flat style heads. So you're just going to pull these two screws, and then once they're completely out, you can see they'll just pop out of there. There is a little lock washer on each of those screws, so you don't want to lose that lock washer that sits on there. So make sure that you hang on to those. Then we're going to flip this around, and we're going to do the other two screws. those screws out of there. Again, making sure that you don't lose the lock washers. And now it's spring loaded, so it basically just kind of comes right apart. Okay, so here's your two buttons. These are stainless steel buttons, at least in the current version. We assume that we'll stay with those, but if we find that they don't work quite as well over time, then we may adjust. But you can see here, basically this is the collar, okay? And then on the collar are these two rings. And these are the pins that fit into the holes. So those pins fit through there, and then fit through there. Now what happens is, when the housing's on there, so these buttons go right here. And let's see if I can show this. If I push that button, it separates the rings. Okay, so when the rings separate, then when those buttons are pressed on either side, then the rings separate, just like this. Well, of course, when they do, then those pins are no longer seated in the holes within the inner pole. Okay, so you can see it's spring loaded. So those springs basically seat here and keep the rings engaged. Okay, unless you push the buttons, in which case then they disengage, they separate, and then you can slide the pole. So again, the process of assembly and disassembly is not that difficult. These springs fit very nicely into the housing, so they're not going to fall out, okay? And if you end up having to replace them or something, if you were replacing the individual components, then they would just pop in and out of those holes in the housing. The other thing you'll notice here is that these screw holes are reinforced so that the screws are not going to pull through the housing. This is a bolt-on housing, very durable, but even still, we've reinforced these holes so that the screws won't pull through, so that you could assemble and disassemble this pretty much as many times as you liked. It's not going to cause any damage or stripping of those holes. Okay, so then when the reassembly occurs, then you're just going to pop this right on here until it feels like it's kind of popped into the slot. So the springs are where they need to be. Same thing on the other side. You're going to pop these on. Oops. Sorry. It's going to go this way. And you'll know whether you've got it right because you can see here only one side is reinforced because the screw isn't actually threading into this side. So make sure that you're not matching these up. So you can see here these are reinforced and these over here are reinforced. You don't want to match those up. You want them to be opposite. Okay, so that way you'll know which way the housing goes together so that it fits properly. Okay, now once it snaps together, you'll be able to feel when the screws are in where they're supposed to be. So you can see the housing now. Okay, you can see this here is what slides through the groove in the pole. Okay, it's easiest to put these in now, not try to put them in and then put the housing together. The simplest way is to basically just insert them while you're holding the housing, and you just don't hold the housing super tight, okay, and then they'll just pop in there. All right, once it's in place, same thing on the other side. You would flip it around, pop your button in, don't hold it very tight until it pops in there. Okay, now you can see again your housing is together, and you would just simply put the screws back into the housing. You would then slide the housing back onto the inner pole. You put the two screws into the inner pole, and then you're going to slide this all the way in and put it onto the outer pole. And then you put those two screws in here, and then it's all done. Honestly, that process, even though this video is fairly long in explaining it, is a very quick process. I think that you could imagine that within literally a couple of minutes, you could have this completely disassembled, and probably in just about as little time, if not less, you could reassemble it. And again, if we send you the entire locking mechanism, then you wouldn't, of course, have to tear this whole thing apart. You basically only have to remove it from the outer pole and then take the two screws out of the inner pole, and you would slide this off, slide on the new locking mechanism, and put those screws back in, which would obviously be an even much quicker process. So I hope that helps you to understand kind of how the locking mechanism works, how easy it would be to remove and reinstall a new one if we send you one as a warranty replacement, and also how durable it is. It's really a very durable mechanism. It works very well. It's not going to break down on you, but of course, if at any time it did, then you would receive a replacement. So thank you very much. Hope that helps.